Kristin Smart was a 19-year-old California Polytechnic State University student whose disappearance in May 1996 triggered a massive investigation, became one of the most haunting and enduring missing person cases in modern American history, and what began as a late-night walk back to her dorm after a college party would spiral into a decades-long investigation filled with missed opportunities, shifting suspicions, hidden evidence, legal battles,
and ultimately a murder conviction nearly 26 years later. Yet even today, many details remain contested and deeply unsettling.
Especially for a case that has lived in the public consciousness for so long that it has become almost symbolic of how justice can be delayed but not entirely denied. On the night of May 25, 1996, a freshman student at a California university attended an off-campus party where she was drinking with friends, and as the night wound down, she was seen leaving the party in an intoxicated state.
As the group returned toward campus, their movements became one of the last confirmed segments of the timeline that investigators would later examine in detail.
And as accounts would later reveal, Smart never made it back to her dorm room that night, and the last confirmed sighting of her alive placed her near the campus area in the early hours of May 26, 1996, when she was seen walking unsteadily and reportedly assisted by Flores,
who claimed he left her near her dorm and went home. A statement that would later become one of the most scrutinized and disputed claims in the entire investigation.
Because Kristin Smart was never seen again after that moment, and when she failed to show up for classes, failed to contact her family, and left behind all personal belongings,
alarm quickly grew among her friends and loved ones, especially her Caucasian mother and father,
who reported her missing and began pushing authorities for immediate action. But in the early stages of the investigation, law enforcement did not treat the disappearance with the urgency it would later demand, initially considering it a possible voluntary disappearance, a tragic misjudgment that would haunt the case for years, while evidence that later surfaced suggested a far more sinister scenario, including witness statements from other students who recalled seeing Smart visibly impaired and needing assistance that night.
And statements that placed her last known movements in proximity to Flores. And as days turned into weeks,
voiceover, search efforts intensified across the Cal Poly campus and surrounding areas, including wooded regions, trails, and off-campus properties. No personal belongings were recovered, and no definitive forensic evidence emerged at the time, which led to increasing frustration from her family and the public. Over time, the case drew national attention and remained the focus of investigative efforts for decades, as authorities continued reviewing evidence and following new leads. After multiple witnesses reported concerning behavior and inconsistencies in his statements, including claims that he had assisted Smart back to her dorm, but contradictory sightings suggesting otherwise. And as scrutiny deepened, investigators also began examining Flores' behavior in the days following Smart's disappearance, including reports that he showed unusual nervousness, avoided media attention, and allegedly made statements that raised suspicion among acquaintances,
while parallel investigations explored whether evidence might have been moved or concealed, particularly as search efforts expanded into surrounding properties in San Luis Obispo County.
Yet for years, the case remained officially unsolved, and Kristin Smart was legally classified as missing, not confirmed deceased, which left her family in a painful limbo where hope and dread coexisted. Over time, the case became one of the most infamous cold cases in California, frequently revisited by true crime journalists, podcasts, and investigative reporters who highlighted the inconsistencies in early police handling and the growing body of circumstantial evidence pointing toward foul play. And despite multiple searches over the years,
including ground-penetrating radar investigations and renewed witness interviews, no body was ever publicly recovered in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance,
which only deepened the mystery and frustration, while legal pressure gradually increased as new technologies and renewed investigative interest allowed law enforcement to revisit old evidence and testimonies, and eventually the case reached a turning point decades later. The investigation reached a major turning point when prosecutors announced criminal charges, marking a significant new chapter in a case that had remained unresolved for decades.
At the same time, additional legal proceedings were initiated involving another individual connected to the case, expanding the scope of the investigation and the court process.
Based on allegations that evidence related to Smart's disappearance had been hidden on property associated with the Flores family. Though these claims would be tested extensively in court, and the legal proceedings that followed became one of the most closely watched trials in California. During the trial, prosecutors presented a detailed reconstruction of the events based on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the investigative timeline, and that her body had been secretly moved and consoled to avoid detection. While the defense argued that the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, unreliable recollections and assumptions built over decades rather than concrete forensic proof, the courtroom became a battleground of narratives.
With emotional testimony from witnesses who had known both Smart and Flores, as well as law enforcement officials who detailed the long and complicated investigative timeline,
including missed leads and evolving theories, and throughout the proceedings, the central tragedy remained the absence of Kristin Smart herself, whose fate had never been definitively documented in physical form, yet whose presence dominated every aspect of the trial. The trial concluded in 2022 with a guilty verdict, marking a significant legal milestone after more than 2 decades of investigation and uncertainty.
While his father was acquitted of accessory charges, a mixed verdict that reflected both the strength and limitations of the evidence presented.
And sentencing followed, with Flores receiving a lengthy prison term, though the emotional impact on Kristin Smart's family remained profound and irreversible. As they had spent nearly 26 years searching for answers, advocating for justice, and enduring public speculation, media attention, and repeated cycles of hope and disappointment, and even after the conviction, Kristin Smart's remains have not been publicly recovered,
leaving a lingering gap in closure that continues to define the case. And the story has since become a cautionary tale about campus safety.
Investigative persistence and systemic failures in early-stage missing person cases, particularly how initial assumptions about voluntary disappearance can delay critical evidence collection in cases where every hour matters. And it has also fueled widespread public interest in true crime storytelling across the United States. With Kristin Smart's name now permanently associated with discussions about justice delayed, the importance of witness credibility, and the long arc of investigative persistence,
although the legal proceedings ultimately reached a conclusion, many personal questions surrounding the case continue to resonate with those who had followed it for years.
Because the central question, what exactly happened to Kristin Smart in those final moments after the party in 1996, still cannot be answered with complete certainty, and her story continues to be revisited in documentaries, podcasts, and investigative journalism pieces that attempt to reconstruct the night step by step, often highlighting how small decisions, miscommunications, and delays in reporting can dramatically alter the trajectory of a missing person case. And in that sense, Kristin Smart's case stands not only as a tragic individual story, but also as a broader reflection on investigative justice in America, showing how a single night can reshape multiple lives across decades, and how truth can emerge slowly through layers of testimony, contradiction, and time, even when physical evidence remains limited or absent. And today, the legacy of Kristin Smart endures as both a warning and a call for vigilance,
reminding communities, universities, and law enforcement agencies that early action in missing persons cases is critical.
And that behind every headline is a family waiting for answers that may take years or even decades to arrive. Although the court proceedings reached a significant conclusion, the personal story at the heart of the case continues to resonate with many who still the recovery of her remains and a final sense of closure that no verdict alone can fully provide, making this case one of the most enduring and discussed true crime. The recovery of her remains and a final sense of closure that no verdict alone can fully provide, making this case one of the most enduring and discussed true crime stories in the United States, defined as much by its resolution as by the long silence that preceded it.
Following the conviction of Paul Flores in 2022, the Kristin Smart case did not simply end,
but by the unresolved human reality that still lingered beneath the verdict, because even after decades of investigation, courtroom testimony, and public scrutiny,
Kristin Smart herself had never been found, and the absence of her remains continued to cast a shadow over every sense of closure that the justice system attempted to provide.
And in the months and years following the trial, attention shifted from courtroom arguments to what investigators, journalists, and the Smart family still called the most important unanswered question. Where is Kristin Smart, and what truly happened to her body after that night in May 1996? And while the prosecution's theory had presented a narrative that she died in or near campus housing and was later moved and concealed, that explanation, though accepted by the jury, did not end investigative efforts, because law enforcement agencies in San Luis Obispo County continued to examine properties.
Even years later, investigators continued returning to previously examined locations, carefully reviewing older evidence and
his connection to multiple locations that had been scrutinized since the early days of the investigation, including properties associated with his family, where cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar had previously indicated possible disturbances, though no definitive recovery had ever been publicly confirmed. And as media coverage expanded again after the conviction, documentaries, investigative podcasts, and news specials revisited the timeline with renewed intensity, often reconstructing the final hours of Kristin Smart's life with forensic precision. analyzing witness inconsistencies,
and highlighting how early investigative decisions in 1996 may have permanently limited the availability of physical evidence.
especially given how critical the first 48 hours of a missing person case are considered in modern investigative standards. And this led to renewed public debate in the United States about law enforcement protocols in campus-related disappearances and how these cases were handled. With Kristin Smart's case frequently cited as a defining example of how initial assumptions about alcohol involvement or voluntary disappearance can delay urgent action. And in parallel, the Smart family, who had endured nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, continued to advocate not only for justice. While the courtroom process reached its conclusion, the story continued to resonate far beyond the legal system, leaving a lasting mark on many lives.
It did not provide the physical resolution that many families of missing persons ultimately seek, and this distinction became central to the emotional aftermath of the case.
As public attention increasingly focused on the difference between legal closure and human closure, and in interviews and public statements, members of Kristin Smart's family expressed both relief and lingering grief, describing how the verdict brought accountability, but not peace. Because without a recovered body, there was still no place to grieve, no final resting site, and no tangible end to the trauma that began in 1996.
And meanwhile, the legal system also continued to process related appeals and motions, as defense arguments attempted to challenge aspects
focusing on circumstantial interpretation, witness reliability over decades, and the absence of direct forensic evidence such as DNA or a recovered crime scene body. Yet appellate courts upheld the conviction, reinforcing the jury's conclusion and leaving the verdict intact, while also reinforcing the broader principle that circumstantial evidence, when sufficiently strong and interconnected, can sustain a murder conviction even in the absence of a body.
a principle that has long been part of American jurisprudence but is rarely seen so prominently in a high-profile missing person case.
And as legal proceedings stabilized, investigative attention again turned outward, particularly toward unresolved leads that had accumulated over decades, including anonymous tips, conflicting witness memories, and geographic areas that had been searched multiple times but were not considered definitively cleared under modern forensic methods. And some of these renewed searches were conducted quietly without major media announcements, reflecting a shift toward more controlled investigative strategies designed to avoid public interference or misinformation.
While law enforcement officials reiterated that the case remained active in terms of evidence review, even if the primary legal question of guilt had been decided.
And alongside official efforts, independent investigators, journalists, and true crime communities continued to analyze the case in granular detail, producing timelines, maps, and speculative reconstructions of Kristin Smart's final movements.
Often focusing on inconsistencies in early witness statements and examining how campus geography may have influenced what could or could not have been seen that night.
Including dorm layouts, lighting conditions, and the distance between party locations and residence halls, all of which contributed to ongoing debates about the plausibility of different scenarios presented during the trial and in this evolving landscape of public discussion. Paul Flores remained a central figure not only as a convicted individual, but as a subject of continuing analysis and understanding how the disappearance may have occurred.
While simultaneously, the absence of Kristin Smart's remains continued to generate new search theories,
including discussions about whether evidence may have been relocated more than once, possibly complicating detection even decades later. And as time progressed, the Kristin Smart case also became a reference point in broader conversations about campus safety reforms across the United States, with universities revisiting their protocols for missing student reporting, alcohol-related vulnerability incidents, and coordination with law enforcement. As policymakers and advocacy groups pointed to the early handling of the Smart case as an example of how procedural hesitation can significantly hinder long-term outcomes. And in media culture, Kristin Smart's name became permanently embedded in the true crime genre,
with her story often presented alongside other landmark cases, where delayed justice eventually emerged after years of persistence.
And yet, unlike many resolved cases, this one remained uniquely incomplete due to the missing physical confirmation of what happened to her body. And this absence continued to shape how documentaries and investigative series frame the narrative, often emphasizing silence, gaps, and unanswered questions rather than definitive conclusions. And even as the legal chapter appeared closed, the emotional and investigative dimensions of the case remained open-ended, because law enforcement enforcement agencies periodically reaffirmed that information could still emerge.
Especially from individuals who had not spoken previously or who might now feel more willing to come forward after the conviction of Paul Flores reduced perceived legal risk or social pressure.
And this possibility of future disclosures kept the case alive in a technical sense, while the broader public memory of Kristin Smart continued to evolve, shifting from an active missing person alert into a historical case study of investigative persistence and systemic failure. And as years passed beyond the trial, voiceover, attention increasingly turned toward legacy, with educational institutions, advocacy organizations, and media outlets using the case to highlight the importance of early reporting, witness preservation, and forensic immediacy, emphasizing how modern investigative tools might have altered.
It became a reminder of how investigative methods continue to evolve and how long-running cases can influence future approaches to seeking answers and justice.
It became a cautionary narrative about time itself, how time can erode evidence, reshape memories, and complicate truth. As the years passed, new perspectives continued to shape the investigation, not defined by the circumstances of her disappearance alone, but by the enduring demand for answers from her family and from a public that never fully let go of her story.
The legal chapter may have come to an end, but certain questions continued to endure, illustrating that some parts of a story can remain beyond complete understanding.
And so the case continues to exist in a space between resolution and mystery, where law has spoken but nature has not yielded its final evidence. And that tension is what keeps the story alive in American true crime discourse, as one of the most studied and emotionally complex disappearances in recent history. Not because of what is known, but because of what still is not. And in that unresolved space, Kristin Smart's name continues to represent both the progress of justice and the limits of reminding audiences that even when a courtroom reaches a verdict, the real-world story can remain unfinished, and the search for complete truth can extend far beyond the final gavel, into years of continued investigation.
Reflection, and hope that someday the remaining answers, especially the location of Kristin Smart herself, may finally come to light,
bringing a form of closure that neither time nor trial alone has yet been able to deliver.